The Wyoming sun beat down on the dusty streets of Dry Hollow, 1887, making every step feel like a weight on the soul. Ellie Hayes walked slowly, boots scraping against the parched earth, the familiar heaviness of the past clinging to her like the constant cloud of dust in the air. She wasn't here to stay, just passing through. A woman with a shadowed past, a wrongful arson conviction hanging over her like an iron chain. A past she couldn't outrun, no matter how far she traveled. She entered the Red Fern Diner, seeking nothing but a glass of water, hoping for a moment of peace in this forgotten corner of the world. The doors swung open with a creak, and the coolness inside briefly offered relief from the scorching heat. The chatter of ranch hands and the clinking of cutlery filled the air, but as soon as Ellie's boots hit the floor, the noise stopped. It wasn't just the heat that silenced the room. It was her presence. The bartender's eyes flickered toward her, and then the room seemed to hold its breath. Ellie knew what was coming. She'd seen this look too many times in too many towns. The whispers started low at first, then louder. "That's her," someone murmured. "Ellie Hayes, the one who burned down the mill." Her heart sank. She had hoped for a moment to slip by unnoticed, but the weight of her past followed her like a ghost. The bartender's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're not welcome here," he said, his tone harsh. She tried to hold herself together, to push past the pain, but the eyes on her were suffocating. Without another word, she turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and the room erupted back into conversation, leaving Ellie alone in the harsh light of day. But just as she stepped onto the dusty street, a soft voice broke through the silence. "Want to meet my daddy?" Ellie turned, and there, standing in the doorway of the diner, was a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, her wide eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Ellie's heart skipped. What could this child possibly know of her pain? But the words, simple and untainted, pulled at something inside her. Maybe it was the way the child looked at her, not with judgment, but with hope. For reasons she couldn't explain, Ellie followed the girl, Laya, as she skipped down the street. There was something about this small, unexpected kindness that made Ellie wonder if there was a chance for redemption in a town that had already condemned her. The journey begins. Ellie followed Laya down the dirt road, the soles of her boots dragging through the dry, cracked earth. The sun was relentless, but Laya's light-hearted chatter made the journey feel a little less heavy. The child pointed out every little detail along the way, the birds flitting from tree to tree, the wildflowers pushing through the parched ground, her voice carrying a sense of wonder that Ellie hadn't felt in years. "Do you have any kids?" Laya asked innocently, looking up at Ellie with her bright, curious eyes. Ellie hesitated, the question stirring an old, painful ache in her chest. She had once dreamed of children, of a family, but that dream had been shattered long ago. "No," Ellie replied softly, her voice catching in her throat. "No children." They continued on, the town of Dry Hollow fading behind them as the road turned into a narrow path leading toward the edge of the town. The landscape began to change. The harsh, dry earth softened into green fields, and the oppressive heat seemed to ease with each step. Ellie could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders, as if the land itself was offering her a brief reprieve. Laya led her through the gates of a ranch, the ground stretching out before them, filled with tall grasses and grazing cattle. It was a stark contrast to the barren town she had just left behind. The ranch house stood at the heart of it all, an old but sturdy building, surrounded by tall pine trees. It was isolated, yet there was something welcoming about it, something that made Ellie's heart race with anticipation and fear. As they reached the porch, Laya looked up at her with a smile. "This is where we live," she said proudly. Before Ellie could respond, the door creaked open and a tall figure appeared. Marshall Carr. His gray-streaked hair and weathered face made him look like a man who had seen more than his fair share of pain. He stood there looking at Ellie, his eyes assessing, guarded. But when Leah spoke, something softened in his expression. "She wants to meet you," Leah said, tugging at Marshall's sleeve. Marshall's gaze lingered on Ellie for a moment, and then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice deep and steady. Ellie hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was truly welcome here or if she was being led into another trap. But there was no turning back now. She stepped over the threshold into a home filled with a quiet, lingering history, a history she could sense but couldn't yet understand. The secrets beneath the surface. Life at Carr Ranch was different. The rhythm of ranch life, the chores, the work, gave Ellie a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. But the house was quiet, too quiet. Marshall Carr, a man of few words, spent most of his time in silence, his presence filling the house like an unspoken weight. Ellie couldn't quite figure him out. Was he a man of hidden kindness, or was there something darker beneath the surface? The only joy she found was in Leah's presence. The child's laughter, her bright eyes, brought a warmth to the ranch that Ellie had almost forgotten existed. And yet, the house itself seemed full of shadows, memories of something lost. Ellie couldn't help but notice the photograph of Marshall's late wife, June, hanging above the mantel in the living room. There was a tenderness in the way Marshall looked at the photograph, as though it held all the unspoken words he could never bring himself to say. Late one evening, Ellie found herself alone in the living room, dusting the shelves. Her eyes drifted once more to June's photograph. She felt an odd connection to this woman, though they had never met. It was as if June's presence still lingered heavy and unrelenting in every corner of the house. It was then that Ellie noticed something else, a journal hidden beneath the floorboards in the attic. The leather was worn and the pages had yellowed with age. But as Ellie opened it, she realized it was June's personal diary. The entries were filled with intimate thoughts, fears, struggles, longings that felt eerily familiar. June had suffered in silence, just as Ellie had. She had lived with her own secrets, her own betrayals, and Ellie couldn't help but feel that they shared a common pain. One entry stood out to Ellie. "I fear for my life. Someone is watching me," it read. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. June had been afraid. Had someone been stalking her before her death? What had really happened to June? As Ellie read on, a chilling realization began to settle over her. This ranch, this house, was filled with more than just memories. It was filled with secrets, and Ellie was about to uncover them all. The land's dark secret. Ellie had been at Carr Ranch for a few weeks now, and with each passing day, the ranch felt more like a home. The steady rhythm of life, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, mending fences, gave her a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. But there was still an underlying tension, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Marshall's quiet demeanor, though soothing in its own way, was a wall she couldn't scale. His distance wasn't born out of anger, but of something deeper. And the ranch itself, this place full of unspoken history, held its own secrets, its own mysteries that Ellie was beginning to feel compelled to uncover. One evening, as Ellie sat on the porch watching the sunset, a thought struck her. June's death. The woman who had once lived here, whose photo hung above the mantel, whose presence still haunted the walls. Marshall never spoke of her in detail, never allowed himself to acknowledge the grief that must have weighed heavily on his heart. There had to be more to the story. It couldn't have been an accident, could it? The story Marshall had told everyone was that June had drowned near the South Ridge, a tragic accident. But there was something about the way he spoke about it, so detached, almost as if he had shut that chapter of his life away in some deep, hidden part of himself. Ellie began to wonder if the truth was something darker. One sleepless night, unable to quiet her racing thoughts, Ellie found herself pacing the house. The wind howled outside, and the walls creaked with the weight of old secrets. She could feel it now. The house was alive with them. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, whispering things Ellie wasn't ready to hear. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, a creeping sensation that crawled up her spine every time she walked through the house. It was more than just the weight of her own past. There was something else here, something that lingered in the air like a ghost. Ellie's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to investigate. She made her way to the attic, the space where so many of the ranch's secrets seemed to be stored. As she rifled through old crates, she uncovered something that made her blood run cold. Papers, letters, old writings, some of which were in June's handwriting. She read through them, her stomach twisting as the words became more and more disturbing. June had written about feeling like someone was following her. She described strange noises at night, someone moving in the shadows just outside her window, and the sense that she was being watched every time she left the house. But the most chilling entry came near the end. "It's him," June had written. "I know it's him. I fear for my life. Marshall doesn't see it, but I know the truth." Ellie's hands trembled as she put the papers down, the weight of the discovery sinking in. June hadn't just drowned. She had been scared, terrified, and something or someone had driven her to the edge. Ellie could only wonder if Marshall knew the truth. And if he did, why was he hiding it? A pattern of betrayal. As Ellie pieced together June's writings, the darkness that had surrounded the ranch seemed to expand, stretching into every corner of her mind. She couldn't stop herself now. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that June had known something. She had uncovered a plot, one that not only involved the town but also Marshall, a betrayal so deep it had torn apart families, including Ellie's own. In one of June's letters, Ellie discovered the shocking truth. June had uncovered a land grab conspiracy, one that involved corrupt town officials and Marshall Carr. The conspiracy had been aimed at taking away land from struggling families, forcing them out so that the wealthy could take control of the land and its resources. Ellie's family had been one of those victims. A letter dated just weeks before June's death detailed how she had planned to expose the conspiracy. She wrote about how Marshall had been involved in the negotiations, how he had taken part in the betrayal of families like hers. The pain in June's words was clear. She had trusted Marshall, and yet he had been complicit in the very thing that had destroyed her family's livelihood. Ellie's heart raced as she absorbed the weight of the words. Marshall had been a part of her family's downfall. He had helped steal their land, their future, and now as she stood here in his home, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, she felt the burning anger of years of injustice flood through her veins. But what hurt more than the anger was the realization that Marshall had never told her the truth. He had never confessed. Instead, he had lived with his guilt, buried it deep, hoping it would stay hidden forever. He had never told Ellie what had really happened. He had never apologized for the pain he had caused. Ellie couldn't stay silent any longer. The betrayal was too great. She needed to confront Marshall. She needed answers, confrontation, and revelation. The next morning, Ellie waited until Marshall was working outside before she approached him. Her heart hammered in her chest as she made her way to him, the weight of everything she had learned pressing heavily on her shoulders. "Marshall," she called out, her voice steady but filled with the rage she could no longer hold back. He stopped, turning to face her. His eyes, always so guarded, seemed to narrow as he saw the look in Ellie's eyes. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that sooner or later, she would uncover the truth. Ellie took a deep breath, her fists clenched at her sides. "You didn't just take my land," she said, her voice low and trembling with the weight of everything she had lost. "You took my father's life, and now you've made a home out of our ashes." Marshall's face hardened at the accusation, but there was something in his eyes, something that looked like guilt. He didn't speak for a long moment, and Ellie's anger grew, pushing her forward. "Why?" she demanded. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you stop them?" Marshall's expression faltered, and for the first time, Ellie saw a crack in the armor he had built around himself. Slowly, he took a step closer, his voice rough with regret. "I didn't know it would go this far," he admitted quietly. "I didn't know what they'd do." Ellie felt a wave of emotion flood over her, anger, sorrow, and even a strange kind of pity for this man who had once been her enemy. But it wasn't enough. No apology, no words could undo the years of pain, the years of loss that her family had suffered. "You could have stopped it," Ellie said, her voice shaking now with more than just anger. "You could have stopped them all." Marshall lowered his eyes, the guilt visible in the slump of his shoulders. "I should have," he whispered. "I should have done something." But Ellie knew it was too late for words, too late for apologies. The damage had been done. As she turned away from him, she realized that the truth was all she had left. The truth about her family, about the ranch, and about herself. But the healing would take time. And it wouldn't be easy. A home in the making. Ellie sat alone on the porch that evening, the warmth of the sun beginning to fade, leaving only the cool quiet of twilight. The ranch, which had once seemed like a prison, a place where memories of betrayal and loss weighed heavily, was beginning to feel different. With every passing day, she had started to see it for what it could be, a sanctuary, a place of healing. Marshall's confession, though it had shaken her to her core, had also opened the door to something else. He had told her the truth, and now there was a chance for something new to grow in the place of what had been lost. It wasn't going to be easy, nothing ever was, but Ellie was beginning to realize that the ranch was more than just a place of old scars. It could be a place where she could start over, where she could rebuild not just her life, but the broken pieces of her past. As the weeks went on, Ellie's bond with Leah deepened. The little girl had become more than just a curious child to Ellie. She had become a symbol of everything Ellie had lost and everything she could still gain. Leah's innocence, her laughter, and the warmth she brought into the house filled a space Ellie hadn't known was empty. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt like she was no longer just existing. She was living again. It was in these moments of quiet joy, teaching Leah to read, tending to the garden, and helping with the animals, that Ellie began to feel a sense of purpose, the small acts of daily life, the things that had once felt like burdens, now felt like small steps toward a life she could call her own. She wasn't just running anymore, she was growing. She was learning to forgive herself, to heal. One afternoon, as Ellie stood at the back door, looking out at the wide expanse of the ranch, she felt a new understanding wash over her. The land, once a symbol of loss, now felt like a foundation, something solid beneath her feet. The house, though it held the ghosts of the past, had begun to feel like a home, a place where healing could happen. Marshall, too, was beginning to change. He had retreated into himself for so long, but now, with Ellie's presence, he seemed to be opening up bit by bit. It wasn't easy for him. He still carried the weight of his guilt and regret. But there were moments, small but significant, where Ellie saw him let go of the walls he had built around himself. And in those moments, Ellie saw a man who was capable of more than just regret. He was capable of change. The ranch, with all its history and heartache, was slowly becoming something else, a place where both Ellie and Marshall could begin again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. Redemption through love. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next, as Ellie found herself more and more entrenched in ranch life. She had become an integral part of the community, helping out at the local school, teaching Leia and the other children how to read and write. The small, everyday acts of care, of nurturing, had begun to heal a wound Ellie hadn't even realized was still raw. Marshall, too, was changing. He had always been a man of few words, but Ellie had begun to see him in a new light. There was more to him than the stoic figure she had first met. He had opened up to her in ways he had never done before, and slowly, the trust that had once been shattered was beginning to rebuild itself between them. One evening, as Ellie sat with Marshall on the porch, watching the sunset, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't grand or dramatic. There were no words, no declarations of love. But in the silence, Ellie felt something shift. She had come to this ranch seeking answers, seeking redemption, but what she had found was something deeper, something more lasting, a connection that had grown between her and Marshall. In the quiet moments, the small gestures, the everyday acts of kindness. Marshall reached for her hand, his rough fingers brushing against hers, and in that simple touch, Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time, a warmth that told her that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't as lost as she had once thought. "You've been here longer than I thought you'd stay," Marshall said, his voice gruff but soft. Ellie turned to him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think I'm starting to understand why." Marshall's gaze softened, and for a moment, the world outside the ranch house faded away. It was just the two of them, sitting together, sharing a quiet moment that held more meaning than any words could express. In that moment, Ellie knew that the road to redemption wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about the quiet, everyday moments where two people could begin to heal together. The final test. As the seasons changed, so too did the ranch. It became more than just a home for Ellie and Marshall. It became a symbol of resilience, of the power of second chances, and of the quiet strength that comes from facing the past and choosing to move forward. But just as Ellie was beginning to feel settled, a final test arose, one that would push her to her limits and force her to confront not just the past but the future she hoped to build with Marshall. The townspeople who had once whispered behind Ellie's back were now watching her closely. They had seen the transformation in her, the way she had begun to integrate herself into the community, the way she had started to rebuild what had been broken. But there were still those who couldn't forgive her past, who couldn't let go of the accusations that had followed her for so long. Marshall, too, faced his own reckoning. A threat to the ranch's future emerged, a financial struggle that could tear apart everything Ellie had worked to rebuild. The land, which had once been stolen from her family, was now in jeopardy again. And this time, Ellie wasn't going to let it slip away. She stood tall, side by side with Marshall, facing the challenge with a quiet strength she hadn't known she had. Together they fought to keep the land they had fought so hard to reclaim. Ellie no longer saw herself as an outsider, as a woman running from her past. She saw herself as part of something bigger, a family, a community, a future. The challenge wasn't easy. There were setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But Ellie and Marshall stood strong, united in their fight for the future they were determined to build. And in the end, it was their love, their bond, and their shared resolve that carried them through. A new beginning. As the final test passed, Ellie and Marshall stood together on the porch, looking out at the land they had fought for. The seasons had changed, and so had they. Ellie, who had once walked the dusty streets of Dry Hollow with nothing but a past full of regret, had found something she never thought possible, a future. Marshall, too, had changed. The man who had once hidden behind walls of guilt and silence was now standing beside her, not as a man burdened by the past, but as someone willing to face the future with her. The ranch, which had once symbolized loss, now represented new beginnings. The land that had been stolen from Ellie's family was now the land they shared together. The house, which had been filled with ghosts, was now filled with laughter, with love, with hope. Ellie and Marshall had both found redemption, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the quiet acts of love and understanding that had grown between them over time. They had both faced their demons, and in doing so, they had found a way to move forward, together. As Ellie looked out at the horizon, she knew that the love they had built was not just born from forgiveness, it was born from mutual understanding, from shared grief, and from the deep connection they had forged through their journey together. And as the sun set over the ranch, Ellie knew that this was only the beginning. Love, she realized, wasn't something that just passed through. Sometimes it stayed forever.